Um, First of all, welcome everybody. Let me just start by telling you that the staff here from the Taub Center is spread throughout the country, and you should just know that there is always a possibility of an alarm, of a siren, in which case some of the people will have to go down to their bomb shelters, to the safe rooms. 2 hours ago, I know here in Petah Tikva we had to be in our safe room. I think quite a few of the people here on the screen from Israel today spent at least some time inside their bomb shelters. So that may happen. If it happens, there will be people who will disappear from the screen all of a sudden. But but there'll be other people who can hopefully fill in if that occurs. So we're really delighted to welcome you to the second exclusive reading we have. This one's dedicated to addressing the ongoing and unprecedented challenges facing Israel. That's what we're doing in the entire series. We want to extend our thanks to our esteemed board members and our dedicated supporters who have joined us tonight. Your unwavering commitment to the Taub Center is instrumental in us completing our mission. For those of you who don't know the Taub Center, who are new to the organization, let me give you a very brief introduction. We are a leading social policy think tank based in Jerusalem. We're dedicated to conducting unbiased, apolitical, data-driven, multidisciplinary research on the most pressing social and economic issues facing Israel. I'm going to take off the live stream screen. Our work covers a range of critical areas, which includes education, early childhood, demography, health, welfare, labor markets, and macroeconomics. And recently, we expanded to include also health and the environment. Our objective is to shape policies that advance the well-being of all Israelis. Israeli policymakers, legislators, media, and citizens rely on the Taub Center and on our research for informed policy decisions and public discourse. Furthermore, philanthropists from around the world trust us to guide their social investments in Israel. It's worth noting that the Taub Center maintains its independence and its trusted reputation across the political spectrum by not accepting any government funding. We are grateful for the support of individuals, foundations, and federations from Israel and around the world. Tonight, we are privileged to have Professor John Gal, the Principal Researcher and Welfare Policy Program Chair at the Taub Center, as our speaker. He'll be addressing the topic Welfare During War, how Israel deals with welfare needs during conflict. Professor Gal is a distinguished scholar in the Paul Bearwall School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His expertise has been pivotal in numerous government committees and other arenas, including his important role in the Committee for Combating Poverty. With respect to questions and answers, you're all invited to put your questions in the chat, and after the presentation is concluded, we'll ask Johnny to address them. With no further ado, Johnny, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Avi, and thank you all for coming. It's been a very difficult more than 2 weeks for all of us here in Israel, I suppose for many of you around the world, and we're still dealing with a very, very difficult situation, us and other people in the region. I want to talk today about a very specific aspect of the conflict, and that's welfare issues and the way in which here in Israel we're dealing with the issues of welfare, dealing with people's needs during a conflict. What I'll try to do, we're only 2.5 weeks into this conflict, so we don't have a lot of hard data and to present a full picture of what's been happening. We've tried to collect data from different sources and to try to put together the picture that I'll try to show you today. But I think this is only the beginning of a study that we'll do at Taub to try to understand the impact of the war on welfare and how we've dealt with welfare needs. So I would really want to begin with, I want to thank Shavit Madhala and Nir Kedar who helped put together this presentation. Before I talk about what I really want to talk about, let me just tell you a very, very brief personal story. We all have personal stories that emerged over the last 2 weeks, very often difficult personal stories. So I'll just tell you mine because I think it'd be useful in trying to understand the topic of this talk. I want to talk about a PhD student of mine. His name is Ron. He was originally from Kfar Aza, which is one of the settlements, the Israeli kibbutzim, just on the Gaza border. Ron arrived on the kibbutz on Friday evening. He'd been at a conference in Germany, and he went to visit his mother and the rest of his family who lived on the kibbutz. He stayed at his mother's place that evening, and of course at 6:30 in the morning, as we all know, the terrible, terrible events of Saturday began. Ron, his mother, his two nieces and his sister went to the security room. They were there for 32 hours in the security room. Ron and his sister took turns in holding the door so that nobody could get in. They were attacked twice by Hamas terrorists in their home. The army was in their home at one stage, but they all survived. Unfortunately, Ron's brother, who was in the security team and the kibbutz, died fighting the terrorists. Ron, his mother, his sister, and his nieces, they were evacuated to Shvaim, which is a kibbutz not far from Tel Aviv, where there's a hotel, and that's where they are now. I tell you Ron's story, of course, to give you a sense of what many of us, all of us perhaps, have seen and felt and over the last 2 weeks. But I also want to use it to try to show the way in which welfare issues have been dealt with for good and for bad over the last 2.5 weeks. So let me tell you a bit about what I'm going to do. Now you can press the button, Michal. Okay. So I want to begin by giving you very, very briefly some of the numbers that are relevant to talking about welfare during this war, so where things stand. Then I want to move on and talk about civil society. Civil society has played a major, major role in dealing with welfare needs during this conflict. We have some numbers on what civil society has been doing, and I want to use those numbers to try to describe the critical role that civil society has played, and also to try to think about what this means for Israeli society today and in the future. Then I want to talk about the government or the state, and I want to try to show you how, unfortunately, the term we often use in social policy is a hollowed out state, to try to show how the state exists, but it's been, to a certain degree, been weakened to a major degree. And what has happened, I think, in the last 2 weeks shows why the state has struggled to deal better with welfare needs. That's changing to a certain degree now. I'll talk about that a bit later. Then I want to talk about some of the people that have really been doing a lot to have an impact on welfare of other people during this conflict, and that's social workers. I admit I'm biased. I teach at a school of social work. I have a PhD in social work, and my wife's a social worker. But nevertheless, I want to try to talk about the importance and the relevance of social work in this specific context, and why social workers really have gone back to their roots, which is a good thing to a certain degree. And then I'll try to conclude by trying to think, okay, what's next? Though, of course, we don't really know what is next. So that's what I'll try to do. And of course, I'll only touch upon many of these issues. I'll be really happy if you have questions, queries, or disagree with what I say, that's fine also. So we can talk, we can deal with that when in another 20 minutes or so. Okay, so let's try to see where things stand, which is, of course, gives the context to welfare needs and welfare services. Okay, so in this conflict until now, the numbers of people killed, civilian and soldiers, is about 1,400 in Israel. We don't know the exact number, unfortunately, even 2.5 weeks after this conflict began, for very different reasons, and some of them are too gruesome to talk about. But these are the numbers, which is a very, very large number for Israeli society, and something that of course, touches many, many of us here in Israel. Okay, besides the 1,400 people killed. There are 222 hostages in Gaza being held by the Hamas, as you all know. 2 women. I know the husband, one of the women who was released yesterday, but 2 women or 4 women have been released, but there are still many, many people being held hostage by the Hamas in Gaza. Go on, Michal. There are still 278 people wounded in hospital, some of them very critically injured as a result of mainly of events on October 7th. Over 1,000 civilian casualties are now being dealt with by 2 departments of the National Insurance Institute, which for people who are not Israeli, that's our social security institution. I'll talk about them a bit later because this is one of the impressive ways in which Israel deals with this terrible situation. And of course, about 300,000 reservists have been called up. This has implications for the economic system, of course, the implications for families, and also even for higher education. 5,000 of students at Hebrew University, for example, are now on active service. Another aspect of this conflict, and a really unusual aspect of this conflict, at least for Israel, is that there are now 130,000 civilians who have been evacuated either from the south, you can see the yellow line around the Gaza Strip, or from the north, you can see the red line around the Lebanese border. So these evacuees, these civilians have been evacuated to different places across the country. I heard that in Tel Aviv there are about 20,000 evacuees, but they've been spread around hotels and across the country. Many of them just left their homes for safety reasons. Others have left because their homes have been demolished or they're under attack, which is the case in the south mainly. We don't know where this is going. Before I move on, then let me just try to tell you what all these numbers mean for the welfare system. Basically, we're looking at people who were victims of the atrocities on October 7th, the members of kibbutzim, and the people living in towns. We're looking at the families of those who were killed or who were taken hostage. We're looking at the evacuee population and all the families of those people, or many of the families of those people who were called up. And all these people who now very often need the support of social services, assistance from social workers, from people who have access to sort of the resources that they need, the help that they need. All these people are added to the over 1 million people who are regular clients of welfare in Israel. So we're talking about really an overwhelming number of people who need the support of social service, need crucial support of social service to deal with issues of trauma, to deal with material needs, to deal with family conflicts, to deal with really diverse needs that they find very difficult to deal with, and they need support. And this is what the welfare or social services need to do. Okay, let's move on and talk about what has happened over the last 2 weeks. One of the really amazing developments over the last 2 weeks is how far civil society, I mean non-profits, I mean the third sector, how civil society was really quick off the mark. You know, these people began providing for needs virtually on day one of this conflict, and have been doing so to really a remarkable degree ever since. So the civil society has really had a dramatic impact on the way in which Israeli society deals with the welfare needs of people. What has happened, just to give you some of the numbers, these were supplied by the Institute for Civil Society and Philanthropy in Israel at the Hebrew University. Professor Michal Almog-Bar provided me with these estimates of what civil society has been doing. So, of course, in Israel, we have thousands of established civil society organizations who have been trying to organize and address needs across the country, both in areas close to the border, but also among the evacuee population. Just to give you an example of one of these organizations, I thought of Latet, which is perhaps the the largest aid organization in Israel. So Latef in the last 2 weeks has distributed emergency aid kits to over 11,000 people. This is equal to $2 million. So civil society, established civil society organizations have really played a major role in addressing needs during this period. What has been really unusual and unique in this period has been the emergence of at least 1,000 new civil initiatives, groups that were established on the local or national level to deal with needs, groups that didn't even exist, or at least they didn't exist to provide welfare needs before that. Some of these organizations are small local organizations. Some of them are big national organizations, but they're providing amazing support and really diverse types of support and addressing very diverse needs across society, across Israel. So these could be local organizations, or they can be large national organizations. One of the really interesting large national organizations is an organization called Brothers and Sisters in Arms. This was a group that was established during the protest movement in Israel, which preceded this war. It was established in the struggle against the judicial overhaul. But the moment the war began, this group began to organize and provide services, provide material needs to people. They have an enormous warehouse outside of Tel Aviv, where hundreds and thousands of volunteers are engaged in providing support for soldiers and for the military and for private people and for communities across Israel. And they're doing a wonderful job. I think when we look at these civil initiatives, we can think to a certain degree of the role that technology now plays, how easy it is to organize people using WhatsApp or using other sorts of technical support. We can also think of how the protest movement, I think, created, or we have groups that emerged from the protest movement that were already organized, and they could change their goals very quickly. And to a certain degree, I think these civil initiatives reflect, I think, a profound sort of mistrust, or at least distrust of the government. And I think people feel the need to organize themselves. So we have hundreds of thousands of volunteers involved in activities now all over the last 2.5 weeks in Israel. The numbers are really amazing. There's always volunteers in times of war, but I think this time the numbers are much greater. And in many places there are too many volunteers to know what to do with. Some people put the number at 1 million volunteers, which is large number for a small country like Israel. So we have hundreds of thousands of volunteers doing amazing jobs in very different ways. Where does the money come from to do all this? So according to the data that I got from the Institute for Civil Society and Philanthropy, about $500 million has come from US sources over the last 2.5 weeks. Much of it from federations, from foundations, say in Toronto, in New York, from JDF, from different organizations that have really managed to send a lot of money to Israel to enable much of this activity to take place. And that's really important. Another source of funding, particularly for the civil initiatives, is crowdsourcing. This is also something relatively new in Israel, at least with regard to volunteering and to welfare services. The estimate is that about $25 million has been collected from crowdsourcing from very diverse organizations, mainly for the civil initiatives over the last 2.5 weeks. And also businesses have been playing a major role in I'll call it corporate responsibility, but basically businesses are sending a lot of money, services, providing different sorts of material support for society. So really, civil society has been playing an amazing role. I was in Shfaim to visit Ron, my postdoc, my PhD student, and the amount of people there, volunteers who were trying to help out, the amount of things that they were providing was really, really stunning. People like Ron reached Shfaim without anything except the clothes they were wearing, and they received everything from a big warehouse that was established near the hotel. They received support from people. It's really been an amazing an effort, and very, very crucial, particularly in the first weeks of this conflict. Without civil society, undoubtedly, the situation of a lot of people in Israel would be very much, much worse. We can ask, I think, okay, so what about the state? Isn't it the state's role to deal with welfare needs? And the answer, of course, yes, this is the state's role, and it will certainly be the state's role in the future. But what we've seen over the last 2 weeks, I hope this is beginning to change, is really the state has really struggled to play a major role in providing for the welfare needs of people. And we see a lack of coordination between different entities within the state. We see a lack of resources to address these. We see very often the state asking people to volunteer to provide services, to provide resources to help out. And we also see a lack of trust between citizens and the state, which is, I think, something that has emerged over the last few years, but became very, very marked over the last year. So really what we seem to see is that the state, at least with regard to social services and provision of welfare, what we see is a state which has really been underfunded over the last 10 years. An estimate that research at Shavit and I undertook, we found that in order to provide acceptable level of welfare service to all of society in regular times, the government needs to spend another $1.5 billion more than it spends today on welfare services. So really, the state was struggling because the welfare services were so underfunded. Welfare services in Israel have been outsourced to a large degree over the last 20 years. In a study that we undertook at the Taub Center a few years ago, we saw that 82% of the budget of the welfare ministry was to outsourced provision of services. This may be a good thing often, but it also creates very major problems for the state's ability to control, to regulate the provision of services. It really takes knowledge from the state and it's in the hands of civil society or private providers. And it creates a weakness, I think, in the state and the state's ability to really control how welfare services are provided. What has happened also over the last few years, unfortunately, has been a sort of a very dominant anti-professionalism sense of anti-professionalism, a lot of criticism of professionals within the government bureaucracy. I think this was enhanced over the last year, but this has existed for a long time. And the result has been that many of the people, the best people in government, and in government there are and have been great people, many of these people left to go to the private sector because they felt that they couldn't do what they need to do within government. So this is really very demoralizing for many people within the government sector. And of course, what we've seen is a real politicization of government. So we see that many of the people who have joined government, or many people who have been recruited for government, have been recruited on the basis of the political affiliation rather than perhaps their knowledge or their capacity. Politicization has also taken the form of the establishment of a large number of government agencies, all dealing with the same issue, in this case, welfare. Today, there are 5 different government ministries, all dealing with different aspects of welfare. They're run by people from 3 different political parties. So what we see is a lot of overlap, a lot of conflict, a lot of squandering of resources that should go to people in need. So all this has created a hollowed out state that has found it, at least at the beginning, very, very difficult to address welfare needs. Of course, there are still, before I talk about social works, I do want to say some really good things about the state and what the state has done. So firstly, one of the really amazing things that we have in Israel, which is unlike any other country, is that we have legislation that provides relatively generous provision, help, material, and cash help for victims of acts of terrorism. And this law, which is really, really important in the past to help people who've been injured or families, people who were killed in terrorist attacks, but this legislation is now being made more inclusive, and also the families of the hostages and the hostages themselves will be covered by this law. This legislation really provides, I think, a generous provision and immediate provision and help for families and for people affected by hostile action. And this is being done very, very quickly over the last 2 weeks. The government is funding the evacuees, or many of the evacuees. So people like Ron are being able to can stay at this hotel, we don't know for how long, and receive food and shelter, etc., because the government began funding this from the very beginning. The government has begun to strengthen its social services. At the beginning, that the social workers were overwhelmed and couldn't really deal with needs. Today, we see more and more government support for the professionals providing, the health professionals, the social services providing support. And we see, I think, a very important development, that is that the government is letting local government provide services and play a leadership role. This doesn't always work, but in many cases, we see that local government is playing a really, really important role in providing and addressing this very specific needs of communities which they lead. So that's important. And finally, I think what we see now, and what I really think is important, is that there's more and more government collaboration with civil society. So what we see now is government establishing joint ventures with civil society, government establishing roundtables where they discuss with civil society needs and ways to address needs. In the social services, one of, I think, the really important initiatives just introduced yesterday, I think, is the government, together with the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, what we call Keren Yedidut, they created a fund, a $5 million fund to provide, address the needs of specific people, the material needs immediately to address the needs of individuals who are either evacuated or live on the border areas. So there's all sorts of collaborations which are really great, and I think this is a good sign that government is beginning to try to address this really unique situation. Let me say something about social workers, because really social workers have come to the fore in this conflict. Social workers are educated, or social workers know that their role is to help people in a broad way when they have needs. So social workers can provide psychosocial treatment. They can help people address issues of trauma, of conflicts within the family, within the community, with other people. But social workers also know that the context is very important. And in a conflict like this, the family and the community is very, very important, particularly in the case of the people who suffered on October 7th. Entire communities were decimated. Half the members of kibbutzim were killed. So it's very, very important when you deal with these people, to try to work think of their community and think how the community can play a role and be strengthened. And of course, social workers are motivated to engage in social justice. This is their ethos. So what we've seen now is that social workers have really been playing a major, major role in trying to address needs during this conflict. I can just give you two examples of two social workers in Shfaim, which is where, as I said, Ron is. So one of the social workers, Efrat Halevi, she was a student of mine. She has her own private clinic in Tel Aviv, but for the last 2 weeks, she closed her clinic and has spent all day, every day, working with people and addressing people's needs in Shfaim. Another social worker, Liron David, who actually lives on the kibbutz, also stopped everything else she was doing and began to work as a social worker. She coordinates all the services provided to people, to the kibbutz members, the members of kibbutz Kfar Aza who live in the hotel, provide all of their needs and deal with families and individuals and try to address their trauma and the difficulties they face after the attacks. So on the one hand, we have social workers playing a really important role. On the other hand, we must realize that social workers have been through very difficult times over the last few years. They've been the subject of really brutal attacks by some politicians. They've suffered from difficult working conditions, low wages, and in fact, in many places in Israel, the social services are very understaffed, not because there's not money to pay for people, because social workers are just not coming to work in social services because of the wages and the conditions. And I think what we see now is that many social workers, both as volunteers or as professionals, are really providing what is perhaps the most important type of service, of social service at this period, which is welfare, which is dealing with people in the context of their needs. Of course, Maxine, yes, social workers, of course, receive training to deal with trauma. Many perhaps don't normally deal with trauma, but I think we should think about social workers as dealing with immediate needs. In the long term, psychiatrists, psychologists will have to deal in the long term with people's trauma and people's needs. But in the immediate, at this stage, you need somebody to go in there to look at their needs in a very, very broad way. So let me just try to summarize this very, very brief overview of welfare needs and the way we've been dealing with them in Israel over the last 2 weeks. We don't know what's next, because this will depend to a large degree on developments, how this war develops. Will more people be evacuated? Will more people be injured? How long will people who are injured, how long will people who are injured who have been evacuated remain far away from their homes? All these questions are unclear. But very clearly, we are already seeing a certain degree of fatigue in civil society. And I think what we should expect is that civil society will gradually, the volunteers, the organizations will be playing a smaller role in providing for needs over time. Already we see in some of the civil society organizations a lack of resources, either because government isn't funding some of the programs that they were providing, or because they've been spending a lot of their resources on addressing these immediate needs. So I think what we're going to see is that some of the civil society will be playing a smaller role. There'll be a greater role for the state, for government, hopefully a more organized and a more comprehensive role for government. I think we'll see more collaboration between government and civil society, and even with the business community, which is a good thing and an important thing, both with regard to resources, but also with regard to addressing needs in very different ways. And civil society does this, and it's very, very resourceful in dealing with new needs. I hope we'll see better coordination within the government between different government ministries. And I hope we'll see... and I hope we'll see much more funding for government for social services in the future. And this will enable more social workers to deal with needs and more resources given to people who have needs. So that I'll stop here. I hope that sort of gave you a sort of an overview of the issue.
Thank you very much, Johnny. That was very, very interesting. I learned a lot. Let's open this up to questions. I will read to you a comment we have from. We have so far two comments. One from Karen Litani, which is a comment, not really a question, and then a question from Anat Gaffney. So Karen says as follows: "There's an overwhelming consensus among the public in Israel that a strong rear is of critical importance in times of war. That the work of volunteers is particularly important. And it is evident that there are many initiatives in the public that are successfully implemented through volunteers. However, long-term volunteering in an emergency situation is not volunteering. It is necessary and important work for everything. Over the years, much research effort has been invested in trying to define what transparent work is. Studies that have examined according to which criteria we distinguish between work and non-work have revealed that the key characteristics of work is an activity for which we receive payment. According to this logic, any activity that can be paid for is work by its very definition, but any activity that does not qualify for financial compensation is not recognized as work. Even if it is arduous and essential, requires skills and involves a lot of effort. So if you want to refer to that, Johnny, if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good comment, and it's something that is really emerged over the last few days with regard to social workers, but also for other people who've been involved in volunteering. So of course, people can't volunteer, at least in the way society is structured today. People can't continue volunteering because they need to be paid for their work. And the question that has arisen is, okay, so look, for example, we have these 1,000 or 2,000 social workers all doing wonderful jobs volunteering. But they can't continue doing that unless they're getting paid for that job. They're doing this either instead of their regular job or in addition to their regular job. If we really think that what they're doing is important, then they should be paid for what they're doing. This is the only way, firstly, to make sure they continue doing what they're doing, and also to enable us to make sure they're doing something that we really need them to do. So I think this is an important issue and something that we'll have to address now that the initial stage of large-scale volunteering is beginning to sort of slowly end.
Thank you. Anat Gafni has asked as follows. She asks, what happens to weak localities? Is there an overarching structure that prevents them from being lost in a situation? For example, I have heard that Sderot is strong, but Ofakim is weak in fighting for their needs.
I actually heard the exact opposite, Anat, but I'm not sure. But I didn't do a study of this, so I don't know. Clearly, the places that were evacuated and were most hit by the war, of course, their situation is worse. This is true of the Bedouin communities in the south and of many of the towns in the south. I know that the government has established, I think this week, a center or initiative to rebuild the settlements and the towns on the Gaza, near the Gaza border. So hopefully that will be one way of trying to strengthen the communities. But the problem is, of course, that local communities not only have the most social problems, they also have the least resources to deal with them, which is, of course, I don't want to say again that we've done research on this, but we have done research on this. In fact, we're publishing it next month. But that's the situation, and this is partly because they don't have the resources, but also partly because the government doesn't give enough resources because of the way funding is structured. So I think it would be a very important thing if one of the things that came out of this conflict is the government learned that if they want good social services, or if they want people to have equal social rights, equal access to good services, then they need to put a lot more money into what happens in weak or low-income communities. This is true of the Bedouin community, of the Arab community, and also some of the Jewish towns, of course, in that area, in the south specifically.
Boaz Ram has put a link in the chat to Ogen, which is a not-for-profit credit agency, which basically gives people who in need because of the war either interest-free or very low interest loans. So I think that he put it there because he'd like people to donate there. Hila Lowers asks as follows. Hi, Hila. Are you aware of any changes in the government budget trying to address welfare issues?
There are no changes in the government budget. There has been some money, more money allocated to certain specific needs. As far as I know, there's been no really comprehensive change in government budgets. There has been money allocated very, very specific needs. For example, paying for the evacuees or paying for their hotels or wherever they're staying, or giving them now some money to pay for Airbnb or wherever they're staying. But I don't think there's any major, as far as I know, there's been no major change in the way government allocates its budget. And there has been a lot of talk, as many people know here, there's been a lot of talk of the government taking money from money allocated according to coalition agreements and using that for other maybe welfare needs also. But as far as I know, this hasn't happened yet in any formal way.
Well, so I'm going to skip over the next question and get back to it in a second, because Rafi Rohn actually asks the same basic question. See if you have anything to add to what you just said. He says, I haven't heard any reference to what the government of Israel is actually funding right now. Do we know?
What it's actually funding right now?
Right.
So what it's with regard to welfare needs, what the Ministry of Welfare has done is try to move some of its funding from certain projects to fund initiatives or initiatives or programs that are relevant specifically to the needs of the war or the people suffering from the war. That's as far as I know. Besides that, I don't think there's been any major spending by the government on welfare in addition to the regular budget, which as Shavit, who is here also and works with me, has shown in the figures that we have, is in fact smaller than the budget last year for welfare.
Dina Friedman asks, is it true that if someone is missing and their whereabouts are not known, but they have not been officially recognized as kidnapped or dead, that the family is not entitled to any social services at this point?
Okay, so of course everybody's entitled to social services, regardless, of course, if whatever their situation is. That the question is if they're eligible for services according to legislation that gives much more generous and more comprehensive services to people who were lost, who died or injured in war or in terrorist attacks or hostile action. Generally, there is a process of trying to verify if people are eligible or not. As far as I know, but I can't say definitely. As far as I know, that the government has tried to expedite and make this process much quicker. And generally, in times of war, the government is not, or the National Insurance Institute or the Ministry of Defense is much more flexible about addressing or providing support, immediate support. Question is, I think, what will happen in another year or so, but that's a different story. But with regard to immediate support, as far as I know, the government normally is relatively flexible about these needs.
Let me correct myself, or actually Boaz corrected me. Boaz Ram, who put on the connection, excuse me, to Ogen that I mentioned before. The reason he put the connection there, the link there, was not in order to ask people for donations, but rather in order to, so that if you know people who are in need, you could refer them to their organization and they will be able to get loans in order to help them through this very, very difficult time. And Boaz, I appreciate for representing it incorrectly. Next question. Do you anticipate any shifts in civil society as it relates to welfare or its relationship to government after the war?
Good question. And my answer is I don't know. Certainly there has been a change in civil society. As I said, all these initiatives, these local or national initiatives that began during the war, I have no doubt that some of them will continue to exist after the war ends. And of course, this may lead to changes in the way the government or us as a society relate to welfare and welfare needs. The government is trying, and I think we should note that that we tend to criticize government. There are a lot of great people working in government. under very, very difficult conditions. And these people are trying, for example, to create collaboration with either civil society or organizations such as the Center for Health Food, the Center for Food Security, which is which is a government or semi-government organization. So there's a lot of collaboration going on, and I hope that this will lead to better thinking about dealing with welfare needs after the war, and maybe different thinking.
The next question we have here from Ita Prince Gibson. Are the people who have been evacuated from places like Be'eri, Sderot, etc., recognized as victims of terrorist activity?
No, not everybody who was evacuated is recognized as victims of terrorist activity. They're recognized as evacuees. I would think that people from Be'eri who directly in some way were affected would be recognized, but I don't think that, but certainly not everybody who's evacuated. We know the numbers, about 1,700 people have been recognized as eligible under this law. But we know that I think from the south, between 60 and 70,000 people were evacuated. So clearly not everybody, and the vast majority were not. They're recognized as evacuees, and they get government support for the period when they're for as long as they're not back in their homes.
Okay, Anat Gaffney asks, I think there's general collective trauma among kids having fears and adults. Do you know if there is a way to address that?
For people, I have grandchildren also, but a lot of kids, of course, this is an issue, and there's been a lot of talk about addressing trauma in different ways. There's a lot of people involved in trying to do this, and I think both in the community and online, there's a lot of talk about that. And of course, I'm not talking about the kids who were in these communities that were directly affected. Of course, that's a very, very different issue. But of course, there are efforts to deal with trauma, and this is what social workers, psychologists, and other professionals do in communities, in Kfar Saba or in Taipei or in Jerusalem. Of course, this is part of what they do.
Ayala Cohen wants to know, from the experience in the Second Lebanon War, the enormous role of civil society was ultimately problematic. Do you think we have learned anything from this time? What do you think needs to be done for the Ministry of Welfare to take a more significant leading role?
Well, firstly, the Ministry of Welfare has to be the Ministry of Welfare and not one of 5 different ministries of welfare. So firstly, the Ministry of Welfare should be a stronger ministry. I think it should deal with both welfare and labor issues. The question, of course, is always the political strength of whoever's leading this ministry and the level of funding, the degree to which the government prioritizes these issues. When governments think that issues are important, then the ministry dealing with them can also play a major role in providing services, in determining policy, and also working with civil society. So that is a political issue. I think really it depends on the degree to which the government or people who want to influence the government can make sure that this is an issue. In certain periods, short periods in the history of our country, poverty was a major issue, and governments and policies are adopted because of that. But in generally, issues of social policy, social services has not been a major issue. And the result is that the Ministry of Welfare is a relatively weak ministry.
Rafi Rohn has asked if you know how many have been evacuated to the north. Nir has already answered that question. He said about 61,000 have been evacuated in the north.
And so the 130,000 is about 70,000 from the south and 60,000 from the north. But the numbers are perhaps larger because these are people that the government knows have been evacuated, but like people who left on their own without going through the government. I suppose the numbers, I've seen the numbers, and the numbers probably about 200,000 in all.
Okay, Karen is adding to the conversation. She tells us that yesterday morning she came to the Finance Committee in the Knesset to present the efficient and useful economic plan she wrote. Grant in exchange for volunteering during wartime. There was a mess and everyone was shouting at everyone else. I couldn't understand what the role of the finance committee members is. Is this a committee that has powers? Do you have access to the ability to influence the members of the finance committee? As it seems only the Minister of Finance decides how to redistribute the budget. I understood from members of the National Economy Committee that the Prime Minister does not deal with the economic issues and left it to the Treasury.
Avi, do you want to answer that, or should I?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so the Finance Ministry, of course, the Finance Ministry is in fact one of the most important parliamentary committees in Israel. It has to approve both the budget and any change in the budget. So it has a lot of power. But of course, the coalition, or the governing coalition, is also dominant in the finance committee. So generally, the finance committee will do what the government wants, or at least what the chair of the committee wants, to make sure that Haredi issues are dealt with in a positive way. Shouts are very common in parliamentary committees in Israel. If this is your first, then I'm sorry that you were surprised. We teach a course to our students, and we spend 3 or 4 days with students in the Knesset every year, and so they know what goes on in committees. And very often people shout, but committees have a major role to play. Sometimes not just in passing legislation, but in putting issues on the agenda. And you can put issues on the agenda in committees, and sometimes it actually leads to changes in policy. Personally, I'm not sure I have a lot of power over the finance committee. Maybe Avi has more than I do.
I used to, but at this point I don't have as much. But yes, so sometimes they do play an important role. Sometimes they play a role in blocking things that you thought that should probably go through, but they don't, because they get blocked in committee. Ita Prince Gibson asks, this is a very, very interesting question. Would you predict that social gaps will increase as a result of the situation? How will that affect social tensions?
Social gaps could increase because of the situation. Of course, this depends, for example, on how many people will lose their jobs and how long they'll lose their jobs for. But also depends on policies. So if policies are adopted that will prevent increases in social gaps, then we can prevent that inequality growing or poverty growing. So this really depends on on how long the conflict lasts, what its impact on society is, on the economy is, and what policies the government adopts to try to address issues of inequality. Unfortunately, issues of inequality and addressing poverty have not been a major issue with a major part of the government agenda in recent years. And one of the results of that is that we have seen poverty and inequality growing. So I hope that this will be an issue on the agenda, and they'll adopt policies that deal with inequality. This is very, very important if we want a society that can work together over time and address its problems.
Johnny, I think I would just add one thing to that, even though I know this is your seminar and not mine, your webinar, but I would just add to that we do know that there are large gaps between the periphery and the center of the country. And the people who are most affected by what's going on are the people in the periphery. So if they're going to be an effect, it would be clearly the effect of harming those people who are already starting off in a less favorable position. So it would be a real concern, and a lot needs to be done to make sure that doesn't happen. I believe we've run to our last question. If there are no more questions, then I think we're just going to thank Johnny. You've got a few more seconds to put something in before I finish. Just thank Johnny for a very, very interesting, very informative discussion. And I'm glad you all came. Welcome to all of you. And we look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. And as people just started writing here, everybody stay safe.